So firstly, I'm not a mental health professional, so bear with me, I'm using an example from pediatrics that I hope is really relevant to you guys. And secondly, I just want to mention that this conversation today is going to focus on racism against Black people. And that's not to suggest for even a single second that there aren't other racial, ethnic, and religious groups that are experiencing prejudice and discrimination. But it is important to recognize that here in San Francisco and in general around the country, some of the worst health outcomes and social outcomes are impacting the African American community. So for that reason, that's where we'll be focusing today. So I actually want to start with a case, and this case is representative of one of my patients, and I changed some of the demographic information to protect his privacy. But I also want to mention that this is just one example of something that I have seen incredibly frequently in my practice. So I want to start by having a meet Ben. Ben is a 6-year-old African-American boy. Ben lives in the Bay Area area of San Francisco with his parents and his grandmother. And Ben's family is very worried because Ben has asthma, which has been very difficult to control. And so every 3 months, Ben's mother misses work to take him to the pulmonologist. And on the bus from her neighborhood to the pediatric pulmonologist, it takes about an hour and a half in either direction for her to get there. So one day, I was at work and I received a phone call from Ben's pulmonologist, and she called to let me know that she had to admit Ben to the hospital for a flare-up of his asthma. And she was really angry, frankly, and she was mad because they had called the pharmacy and they had discovered that Ben had not picked up his controller asthma medication last week, and that he had missed a bunch of school recently because of wheezing. And then she went on to tell me that she was even more upset because his father had been arrested last month for drugs, and did I know this? And she concluded by letting me know that she was fed up with Ben's family not taking his health seriously, and that she needed to teach his parents how to start really taking their son's health care, making it a priority. And so she decided that the most appropriate way to do that would be to call CPS. I want to mention that in my practice as a pediatrician, it is very often that my fellow colleagues kind of use CPS as a way to kind of enforce whatever they as pediatricians think is the best thing for their clients. And it's a really hard and dangerous practice that I see commonly. I don't know how that happens in mental health. Anyways, after I got that phone call, I was pretty upset and I was worried about Ben's family, and so I gave Ben's mom a call to ask her what was going on. And she let me know that one thing around the medication is that she couldn't afford to pick up his refill until she had gotten paid next week. Ben's mom actually had insurance through her employer, and as a result, she had a relatively high copay on his medications. I think it's also important for us to note that here in San Francisco, there is a huge disparity between the median Black income and the median white income. And I can't even begin to imagine what it would look like to live on $27,000 a year in this city, especially if you have a kid. But this is what the median income for Black people in San Francisco is currently. And it's also important to note that we have twice as large of an income disparity in this city as what is the national average. She also mentioned to me that she usually gives him his medication every day, but it still isn't working. He's still wheezing. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that the Bayview, which is the last predominantly Black neighborhood in San Francisco, has an unusually high burden of pollution, both air pollution and surface pollution. And this is just a lot to have to do with what is in the Bayview. There's a lot of freeways, but also within the Bayview is a lot of factories and industrial sites, and actually a lot of parking lots for places like UPS and FedEx and the school buses around the city. And so what happens is these vehicles are often just in the parking lots idling for long periods of time. And all that time of all of this air pollution ends up affecting all of the people who have to live, work, and play in the Bayview area. This was back in 2015, before we decided to legalize marijuana in the state. But she pointed out that, the arrest on drugs was just that Ben's father had a little bit of weed in his pocket. And she points out that the police are always harassing people in her community. And so the ACLU put out this wonderful graphic that basically shows that smoking weed and using quote-unquote substances is not a Black thing. It's like an all of us thing. Apparently we all smoke a fair amount of weed. But it's only Blacks that are really facing the legal consequences of this. And we see this very much being the case in San Francisco County and Alameda County. But nationwide, Black people have been 4 times more likely than white people to be arrested for marijuana possession. And this just has to do a lot with how we police Black communities in this city and in this country. And this mom said, frankly, I cannot believe that the doctor called CPS on us. I do not want to bring my son to her anymore. And I think that is a very valid way for her to feel. The NCAC did a wonderful study that kind of looked at racism within CPS. Excuse me. And they found that black children are 3 times more likely to enter the foster care system compared to white families that had the similar characteristics as the families. But furthermore, once black children enter CPS, it is much harder for them to get out because NEEKC found that they receive much less support. They're less likely to have good contact with a social worker. The judges are more likely to set more hoops for the parents to jump through. And as a result, when these kids get removed by CPS, it is much less likely for them to re-enter with their families. But we know that being with their families is definitely one of the healthiest places for most kids to be. And so I often kind of think about what exactly is going on, right? Like this doctor, the pulmonologist, she's a wonderful, well-intentioned person that went into her work because she wanted to help people, and she's very similar to a number of my colleagues in the medical field. And so what is this that, professionals who are very concerned about racial health disparities and who are concerned about taking care of quote-unquote vulnerable populations, why is it that so frequently we are still kind of perpetuating racism? And in 2015, one of the New York City health officers published this commentary in the New England Journal of Medicine. And basically what she wrote is that even as research on health disparities has helped to document persistent gaps in morbidity and mortality between racial and ethnic groups, there's often a reluctance to address the role of racism in driving these gaps. And a search for articles published in the journal over the past decade, for example, reveals that although more than 300 focused on health disparities, only 14 actually contain the word racism. And so I think that really gets at it, right? Like in general, in our field, we like to kind of talk around racism, we like to acknowledge the existence of racism, but we don't actually talk about racism and specifically what our roles are in racism. So today, what we're going to be doing, we're going to be talking about racism. Last time I was here last year, I shared these 2 slides, but I think it's really important for understanding, so I'm going to share them again. There is a wonderful physician and public health researcher named Kamara Jones. And in one of her articles that she wrote about the levels of racism, she talks about this allegory that's called the Gardener's Tale. So I'm going to try and do my best rendition, although she does it much better, and I encourage you to go on YouTube to watch her do it. So basically, the story is that there was a woman who bought a new house, and she was a gardener, and in front of the house there were 2 planters, and one planter was empty, and the other planter was full of soil, but that soil was rocky and old and hard and malnourished. Anyway, so she decides that she wants to plant flowers in front of her house. So she goes to the hardware store, and she, of course, buys some new soil, and then she also goes to buy some seeds. Now, this gardener has a very strong preference for red flowers, so she thinks, I'm going to plant some red flowers in front of my house. But when she goes to buy seeds, there is only 1 packet of red seeds, and then there's packets of other colors of flowers. And so she decides, fine, I guess I'll just get some purple flowers, even though I really don't like purple flowers that much. And when she gets home, she puts the purple flowers in the old, hard, rocky soil, and then she decides that because she loves the red flowers, she's going to use the new, nutritious soil and plant the red flowers in that nutritious soil. And not surprisingly, what happens a couple of months later is that the red flowers grow up strong and healthy and robust, and the purple flowers grow up scrawny and stunted. And those flowers go to seed, and the next generations of flowers grow up, and the same thing happens. The red flowers are strong and healthy looking, and the purple flowers are weak and scrawny looking. And she says to herself, well, see, obviously I was right to prefer red flowers. Look at how much more beautiful, healthy, and strong they are. And Kamara Jones tells this story to help us kind of understand what institutional racism is and how it functions in our society. So often we're just looking at the flowers and we're noticing that one side is thriving and the other side is really struggling, and we blame it on the flowers instead of trying to understand what is the soil in which these flowers are trying to grow. And so I want to spend a little bit of time understanding what does institutionalized racism look like in San Francisco. So one of the places where we see a lot of institutionalized racism in the city is in our school districts. And so as you can see from this graph, the 3rd grade English proficiency is a huge disparity between white student English proficiency and black student proficiency. We see something similar with math, and we also see a really huge disparity in terms of graduation rates. And just this week, a study came out that basically said that San Francisco is the worst county in the state for black student achievement. And that in comparison to other much less wealthy counties, San Francisco still has the lowest black achievement. So In English, when you look across all grades, only 23% of San Francisco Black students are performing at grade level, and that's in comparison to 67% of white students and 79% of Asian students. We see only 19% of Black students are performing at grade level in math. And so I just want everyone to take a second and think about what are the ramifications of that are. Think about what the ramifications are for those students themselves and their ability to become employed going forward. Think about the ramifications for us as a society, right? And who is going to be in charge running things, who are our researchers, who are our future leaders, and how are they being educated. But I also just want to remind everybody that this is one of the wealthiest cities in the entire country, and yet this is what's going on with our African American children. We also have a huge disparity in terms of rates of unemployment. And so the Brookings Institute did a study earlier this year. And what they found was that San Francisco has the second highest rate of Black unemployment in the country when looking at 130 metropolitan areas. And the only other city that has a higher rate of Black unemployment is Detroit. So we have Detroit, and then we have San Francisco. And it's also important to recognize that unlike Detroit, San Francisco has the fourth lowest rate of white unemployment, right? So white people are not having a hard time finding jobs. This is something very specific to Black people. So San Francisco has the highest discrepancy between Black rates of unemployment and white rates of unemployment. 48% of Black children in this city live in poverty. And that is in comparison to only 2% of white children. And for those of you guys who deal in the world of trauma therapy and trauma care, you can appreciate that living in severe poverty is an incredible form of trauma. Now, if half of this city's Black children are living in trauma, you can appreciate what the long-term ramifications are of that. And then, of course, it's really important to recognize how racially biased our policing is. And not too long ago, right now, in my work in the DPH, we had a wonderful pediatrician come and talk to us a little bit about police shootings and the disparities in police shootings. And per capita, because San Francisco has very few Black people, but per capita, San Francisco is number 3 in terms of cities and police shootings by police. So, not dissimilar, we also have a huge disparity in terms of who is being convicted of crimes. The vast majority of convictions across the country are around drug-related issues. And there's a lot of NIH data that shows that, in general, Americans of all races are using drugs at a relatively similar rate. So we can't explain this disparity in convictions based on this disparity in criminal behavior. Similarly, Black people in the city are much more likely to be stopped by police and to be searched by police, despite the fact that 98% of these searches don't turn up anything illegal. And my husband and I experienced this exact phenomenon when we first moved home to San Francisco, because within just 2 weeks of us moving into our new neighborhood, my husband got stopped on 2 separate occasions while he was sitting in our parked car with our family while I was trying to get my son strapped into his car seat, and the police came and knocked on the window and then made up some excuse about how he wanted to test how tinted our windows were, right? And then once my husband unrolled the window and showed the whole family and showed, my son is a very articulate little kid who has some things to say to the police because he's my son. And once he saw all of this, then he backed off a little bit and, I hope you guys have a nice day. But this is a day-to-day reality that all Black folks living in San Francisco have to deal with. And so, then the question becomes, wait, don't we live in this city where people we just hate racism, right? Like when the white supremacists came to our city, we freaked out, right? We hate racism, and yet we are producing these incredibly remarkable racist outcomes in this city. And so I want to kind of talk about what is that about and what might be going on. In order to do that, I want to bring up one of my very favorite theories, which is cultivation theory. And this is a theory that comes out of the field of communications. And it's the third highest cited communications theory in the literature. And the producer of cultivation theory was a man named George Gerbner, and he started doing this work in the late 60s. And basically what cultivation theory tells us is that people who watch a lot of TV, they are more likely to think that what they see on TV is what is true in reality. And so basically what cultivation theory tells us is the more media we consume, the more likely we are to believe that what we see on media is true of the real world. And so since the initial work on cultivation theory, which was really looking mostly around crime They were looking at how people who view a lot of TV are much more likely to think that the world is full of criminals, are more likely to think that they are going to be a victim of crime. But since then, people have kind of expanded this to look at the other ways in which we have been cultivated by media, and not just TV, but of course it's very relevant how we are cultivated by movies and social media, as well as actually print literature. And so cultivation theory eventually kind of has evolved to state that TV watching and other types of media consumption are actually cultivating the norms of our society. And one of George Gersner's last papers he wrote about was talking about how in this country, what used to cultivate were the values and the regular aspects of our society, what is normal, was cultivated at the pulpit. And so the church kind of set what is the norm and the standard. But in the last 50 years, that has transitioned, and now it's very much media that kind of sets what we identify as normal and the values that we prioritize in this country. And so I want to think a little bit about what TV is telling us about black people. Black people are criminals. They're dangerous and they're violent. Black people are drug users and drug dealers. Black people don't know how to manage their money. And we need to be scared of black people. We see it with black men. We also see it with black women. Black women are conniving and scheming. Black women are hypersexualized. Black women fight and dangerous. Oh, black women are sassy. And of course, black women are drug addict mothers. We see these images presented to us on media over and over again. What does the news tell us? Well, despite the fact that 80% of murders in this country are committed by white people, and that is just a numbers issue, who do we see on TV as representing the murders? Who shows up on our news night in and night out about committing murders? Similarly, who is the face of gang violence? Who is the face of welfare users? Who is the face of students failing and students being unable to succeed in school? And it's not just where we see black people in the media, but also where we don't see black people in the media. So we don't see black people as heroes. We don't get to see black people as your friendly neighbor that you want to go across the street with and have a latte. We don't get to see black people as viable romantic partners or love interests. We don't get to see black people as smart or nerdy or intellectual. We don't get to see black people as leaders of industry. We don't get to see black people as complicated, emotionally nuanced individuals. I think it's really interesting in the wake of, I want to say the most recent police shooting, but unfortunately, mass shooting, but unfortunately that's not the case. But so often, and we saw this with Dylan Roof, and again with the Las Vegas shooter, so often our media likes to present them as these sympathetic cases. Here are his interests. Oh, he likes gambling, and he lived a quiet life, right? But meanwhile, so often when we see the victims of police shootings, they're presented in an absolute opposite way. And here with our mainstream liberal newspapers, these are some actual articles that happened in the wake of both of these horrible attacks. And so what is socialization? And how is media socializing us? And so as you guys probably know, socialization is kind of how we as a society transmit what our cultural values are and help us kind of understand what our beliefs and norms as a society should be. And I think it's important that everybody try and take away from this talk that they need to consider the ways in which media has socialized us. And we need to think about, we have had decades upon decades, for most of us, of consuming this very highly racialized media, and so it begins to shape the way in which we see the world. And so I want everybody to just get really honest with yourself, and you don't have to say anything out loud, but I want everybody to please just take a second and decide, how do we feel differently about these two pictures? It's the same action, and yet one seems like something that you might casually do on a Sunday with some friends, and the other one seems like a delinquent behavior. Why do we feel differently about these two pictures, right? One is our hippie friend from college that we ran into at Dolores Park, and the other one is a criminal. Why do we feel differently about these two images? One are some hipster kids that are just expressing their style, and the other ones are hoodlums or thugs that are probably hiding their faces because they're going to do something dangerous. And I work right now on looking at how we can reduce preterm birth in San Francisco and the racial disparities of preterm birth. And something that we hear from black moms over and over again is the way in which they are made to feel by their providers that it's not acceptable for them to be having kids if they're black. because they are too poor and unable to care for their kids, that there's something irresponsible about them having large families or even small families. And so I want us to just be honest with ourselves and recognize the ways in which we have been socialized might make us feel differently about these two images. Lastly, and my husband wasn't sure if I should put this one up. But I want to be honest for a second, because I can't tell you how frequently I hear from people, well, if they would just pull up their pants, right? Like, for some reason, the way how a lot of young black men decide to wear their pants is like centers around like how we like morally assess them on our moral or values compass, right? But they're not the only ones who don't wear belts in our society, right? So I'm just trying to really have us get honest about why we feel so differently about this. I also want to remind people that it's not just media that is socializing us, it's very much school as well, right? I think it's important to recognize this is what the ethnic representation of schools look like in San Francisco. But whose history are we studying? Do we study 33% Chinese history? Whose literature do we read? Are we reading 23% of Latino literature? Whose heroes do we celebrate? Are we celebrating 10% African American heroes? How does what we learn in school shape our understanding of who is valuable and who is important? It's coming up on Thanksgiving, and so I have, one of my kids is 19, and when she was 8, she came home from school right before Thanksgiving, and she had this little, like, pilgrim's cutout, and she went on to tell us about how she learned around the Thanksgiving mythology in school, and I lost it. I lost it, because, you know, we were paying for, like, a private Montessori school in Pasadena, and I was like, this is what you guys are teaching us? But I think it's really important as we come up on Thanksgiving, we love to share with anybody who will listen this wonderful Thanksgiving mythology about, oh, how the pilgrims came over, and like the Native Americans and white people, like they helped each other, and that's why we celebrate Thanksgiving. But the reality is that this country committed an incredible genocide of Native American people, right? We killed 4.5 million Native American people, to the point that the people who are the indigenous population of this land are by far the smallest demographic in this country. We don't talk about that at Thanksgiving. And so that is yet another example of the ways in which we are socialized by school to not really see race, deal in race, talk about racism. So I kind of want to go on and look at that a little bit more. I feel like somewhere along the line in the last 50 years, we have warped the message of Dr. King. When Dr. King was talking about how he dreams of a time when people will not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character, somehow we in the United States have kind of decided that what that should mean is that we don't see race. Oh, I don't see race, I just see what's inside. Somehow, over the last few decades, we have managed to equate the idea of acknowledging race with being racist. And therefore, if you don't want to be racist, then you better not acknowledge race. But the challenge with that is that we have been socialized in a highly racist way for decades upon decades. And because we don't deal in race, don't think about race, don't acknowledge race, we as a country have not taken the time to understand and explore how this socialization is impacting us. And so for those of us as providers, it's a really hard thing that we need to start to figure out how to negotiate. We have this racial socialization, this colorblind ideology, structural racism, and unexamined biases, right? How does that start to impact the ways in which we can take care of our clients? I feel like when we don't really examine this, it impairs our ability to develop meaningful rapport with our clients. We had a wonderful meeting recently with a guy named Hector Flores Sanchez, and he runs an organization called the National Compadres Network. And when he talked about his work, he felt like one of the most important things that he does in his work is he just tries to remind providers that all people are sacred, and that you have to deal with your clients as sacred individuals. They cannot just be units of service that you are providing, right? And that's like a really basic thing, and yet, for whatever reason, or maybe for the reasons that I've just explained, it's something that needs constant reminding. I think it also is important for us to recognize how some of the things I just discussed might impact a client's ability or willingness to adhere to whatever treatment regimen we are prescribing for them. And lastly, I just want to talk about how these things, they impact provider burnout, because that's a huge issue that is going around across the country. And for those of us who are very committed to these populations, we find ourselves working after hours, through our lunches, trying to figure out how to support these clients. And yet, for those of us who've been working for any amount of time, you see that you do this year in and year out, and nothing is changing. If anything, in a lot of ways, things are getting worse. And that's what leads to provider burnout. So what do we do about this? So first and foremost, I'm granting everybody in this audience, as of today, I grant you guys permission to please start seeing race, okay? It's really important because it's part of people's identity. I am black. I'm super proud to be black. Most black people I know feel the same way. It is fine to notice that we are not white. It structures people's opportunity, people's race. And so it's really important that we recognize the ways in which their opportunities are structured differently based on their race. Understanding race is important because the story of race and racism is the story of America. And when we don't see race, then we are erasing an entire centuries of history that really have a huge bearing on the different kinds of outcomes that we see today. And lastly, it's important to see because I can promise you that race is front and center in your black clients' lives. We need to start talking about race. And I really want to encourage everybody in here to please practice talking about race with your colleagues before you try and do it with your clients. Because unfortunately, as a result of the ways that we have been socialized, we generally do not have a lot of experience or competency in speaking about race. And so I encourage everybody that if you hear something racist, please say something about it. And conversations about race and racism don't have to be confrontational. In fact, I would encourage you to have them not be confrontational. If anything, we can try and approach it with compassion, understanding that all of us have been socialized in the exact same ways if we have been exposed to American media for any proportion of our lifetime. And so we can recognize that oftentimes things that happen may not line up with what somebody's intentions are. So we can kind of question, what do your intentions look like? And then just remind people that maybe what just happened, what you just said, is not lining up with your intentions because here's how I perceived it. But I just want to please challenge everybody in this room that when you notice something racist or something is racist said at work, to please just say something about it. We need to get knowledgeable about racism. As I hope I've demonstrated so far today, we do not talk about this enough in our country, in our media, and so it is incumbent upon each individual who cares about this issue to learn about this issue. And so I know we are busy folks, and so here are 4 wonderful documentaries that can help people really become knowledgeable about the history of race and racism in this country, in particular against black people. But if you have more time, there are some wonderful articles that have been written and some incredible books as well. I would encourage everybody who has black clients to practice some perspective taking. So one thing I would encourage everyone to do is to try and do what you're asking your clients to do. And what that might look like is to try and go grocery shopping on a salary of $27,000 a year. Or try and run your errands on the Muni. And in particular, try and run your errands on the Muni out of the Bayview district. And if you are feeling really brave, borrow somebody's little kids and do it too, because, you know, this is what our clients are actually up against. And when you actually try, for example, to take a Muni bus from the Bayview all the way over to CPMC, or even here, it takes much longer than most people would expect, in part because it's kind of long, but mostly because of the way we have structured our public transportation in the city. I also want to encourage people to observe how black people are treated around the city. So sometimes on my way home from work, I take the J Church. And I get on at Van Ness Station around 18th and Church. What usually happens around 6:30 is that a number of the football players are getting off of practice at Mission High. And the majority of those football players are black students. And they get on a bus of crowded, mostly white people coming from their fancy downtown jobs. And they're loud and they're noisy, as most teenagers are. And everybody on the bus is clutching their plurals and rolling their eyes like, oh man, these kids, what are we going to do about these kids? And then what happens is the bus goes a little bit further and it gets to 24th and Church. And some other kids get on the bus. And I don't know what school they're from, but they are wearing uniforms and they're predominantly white. And they're also loud and they're also rowdy. And those same people on the bus are, oh, look at those teenagers. And don't you remember when? And I just want everybody to really kind of think about what the experience for those black football players must be like when they get on the bus every single day and have to face the silent and yet very loud criticism of an entire bus full of adults, right? I want people to just kind of start to notice if there's a black person in front of you in line at the bank or at the store, how they are treated. Do they have to show their ID when they pay with a credit card? And do you? I just want people to kind of start to notice the ways in which in our very progressive city, black people receive very different treatment. And lastly, I want to encourage people to try taking your black clients' perspectives during meetings. And this is by no means to say that we are or should try to assume that we can speak for our black clients because we can't. But I want people to notice that so often when we're sitting at meetings, that deal with some major programmatic or policy shifts, it is very infrequent that our Black clients have a voice at that table. And so I just want people to kind of practice imagining, if my Black client were here, what might they say? What would their concerns be? What would they wish that this outcome would be? And if it's possible, can you represent some of that perspective at your meeting? We need to start to check our racial socialization. And so I hope that we can all take it for granted that all of us have been socialized in a highly racialized way in this country. And so we need to kind of start to figure out, how are we going to examine that? One of the ways that we can do this is we can journal about how our socialization impacts our practice. Here are some suggestions for potential questions that you can start to journal around. In what ways does my racial socialization shape the ways I perceive my clients? I want everyone to take it for granted that your racial socialization is shaping your interactions with your clients. But it would be really helpful for people to start to dig deep about what ways that might be the case. How does it impact my ability to connect to my clients? How often do I interact with Black people who are not clients? And in what ways is that shaping or changing me? How does my socialization shape my clinical approach? So often in the world of pediatrics, people feel like when they're dealing with Black clients, they have to have a tough love approach. Oh, if these people just only understood. But, you know, we are clinicians, and our role is never to be punitive. And so it's just really important to kind of get thoughtful and honest with yourself about how your socialization might be impacting you. In order to do this work effectively, we have to learn how to manage the strong emotions that are going to come along with it. When people really start to look at racism, I mean really honestly start to look at racism, what inevitably comes up is a lot of shame, a lot of rage, perhaps some despair. And if you are not ready and capable to manage these emotions, a lot of times you will just disengage. But that is only how we perpetuate the problem. And so it's important to figure out what is it that we, each of us as individuals, need to do in order to create the resilience we need to be able to handle those emotions and keep on moving forward. We need to start to dig deep at work about how our racial socialization is impacting our policies and our practices at work. How do our agencies' practices and policies inadvertently contribute to racist outcomes? It's not an accident that we have these high racial disparities in San Francisco. It's a result of institutions, policies, and practices that have existed for decades. This is not something that we can just do in a few hours. This is not something that we can do as a one-off. Oh, I'll take questions at the end if that's okay. This is something that we need to do on an ongoing basis, and we have to dedicate significant resources in order to get it done. And one thing that I love is that Race Forward has a racial equity impact assessment toolkit. And so in the same way how if you were, for example, going to dig a massive pipeline through Native American lands, there's an expectation that you will do an environmental impact assessment to understand what the ramifications are. What Race Forward is suggesting is that before you put any policies or practices into place, you do a racial equity impact assessment to understand what some of your inadvertent impacts on race and racism might be through that practice or policy. I also want to talk about equity versus equality, because when we move through the world with a colorblind ideology, it leads us to equality-based solutions. And so basically, I love to use the example of bathrooms to demonstrate the difference between equality and equity, right? So let's just pretend that you and some friends of both genders go to the movie, and at the end of the movie, everyone has to go to the bathroom, right? And what always happens, you go to the women's bathroom and there's a super long line, and the men go to the bathroom and they are in and out fast, right? But that's what equality looks like. Equality is when we know that people have different needs and different uses, but we are building the exact same size bathroom. And what ends up happening, not only does it disenfranchise the women because they have to wait in the long line, but it's actually disenfranchising the men too because they have to wait for their friends, right? So nobody in society wins when we have an equality-based approach. But an equity-based bathroom would look like understanding that the ways that women use bathroom is different, and they need a larger bathroom. And we know we have achieved equity when everybody, regardless of your gender, is waiting the same amount of time to use the bathroom. What might equity look like at work? Well, it might look like a disproportionate amount of recruitment and representation of historically underrepresented groups among your staff. So often I hear that, oh, we wish that we could hire more Black clinicians, but we just can't find any qualified clinicians, right? I hear it all the time, but it's not the case. We are out there, but the challenge is that a lot of these institutions, our recruitment practices, have produced highly racialized staff outcomes, right? And so these things replicate themselves because people who are current staff are the ones who are going to tell future staff to start to apply for jobs. And if we don't make a very intentional effort to start to look at how we recruit and where we recruit, these systems are only going to reproduce themselves. Equity also might look like a disproportionate amount of time spending learning how to care for Black clients. We know that in San Francisco, mental health outcomes are highly racialized. Black people are twice as likely as white people to be hospitalized for depression. Black teens are 3 times as likely as white teens to do self-harm. And so it's really important that we start to recognize, well, if Black people are having a disproportionate impact of mental health issues, then we need to get really extra good and disproportionately good at taking care of these children. Equity might also look like increased accessibility and availability for clients who are facing high structural barriers. So we know that there are a number of structural barriers that disproportionately impact Black people, right? So what can we do in our work to try and help overcome these barriers and have clients have increased accessibility to mental health services? So for example, where are our clinicians practicing and how easy is it for those who are most impacted by structural barriers to access these services? And what can we do in each of our individual agencies to make it easier for people who already have really high hurdles to jump? And also, a disproportionate amount of energy and time and thought around innovative strategies to engage Black clients in care. And so another thing that happened a lot of times in a couple jobs ago that I had is that our mental health providers would have difficulty engaging Black clients. And instead of doing a little something extra to reach out and make these clients comfortable, they would just be like, oh, well, these clients don't care or they're not going to do it, right? So often what I found is that when my clients don't engage with me, just dropping them a letter in the mail, like a handwritten personal card, I got some at the 99-cent store, they could just sit at my desk, just dropping that in the mail real quickly for people was all it took to have our clients engage with me in my pediatric services. And so just want to encourage everybody that these clients that are disproportionately impacted by structural barriers and mental health outcomes might need a disproportionate amount of effort in order to be engaged. Another thing that we can do about it is to be social justice focused. And so when I found this graphic around equity versus equality, I also found this third graphic that I love, which is justice, right? It's not enough to just put the differently sized boxes underneath so everyone can see over the fence. What justice looks like is actually tearing down the fence. What does justice look like? Social justice look like? It might mean validating our clients' experiences of racism. So often students tell me things like, oh, that teacher, she really doesn't like me. She's so not fair the way how I get treated. I have students that will get suspended and they'll say to me, you know what, it's not fair. And very often the response to those students is, well, you know, you did do this and you need to understand how this impacts the classroom. Instead of saying, hey, you know what, it might not be fair because the reality in San Francisco is that while we have only 10% of the students are Black, they represent 44% of the suspensions in the city, right? So it, in fact, might actually not be fair. And we need to validate that for our clients. Similarly, we have students saying all the time, like, I'm bored in class, I hate school. And instead of going straight into, well, you know, you need to work hard in school, it's important, we might need to validate, like, yeah, you might be bored in school because no one is teaching you about your history and no one is making an effort to make this culturally relevant for you. And so what would it look like for us to just validate our students' experiences? And this is not to say to the exclusion of also encouraging them to do well in school and participate in class, but to also give them a reality check that, yeah, what you are saying is in fact right. We can't just teach resilience skills in the face of these injustices. It is not acceptable that what we bring to our clients is some breathing techniques when they are facing incredible discrimination. What we need to start thinking about in our work is how do we encourage their empowerment and liberation? What can we as clients start to do to give these students the tools that they need to actually change their situation, not just tolerate it? So often our solutions are really based around increasing resilience in quote-unquote vulnerable populations. And there's something that feels really dishonest and unfair about that. What we're saying basically is that we are not going to do anything to address the structures that disadvantage you. Rather, we're going to give you the tools to better tolerate the structures that disadvantage you. We need to discover and acknowledge the structural barriers in our clients' lives, right? It's really important for us to recognize what our clients are up against and what they're facing from a structural level. There was an article that was written recently that actually provides a screening tool that clinicians can use to understand what the structural barriers their clients are facing, and it's something that can be filled out before they do in the interest of time, but not just discovering the structural barriers, but then actually working with our clients to help address them, right? This is some of the work that we can do to become more social justice focused providers.